So good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all had a wonderful week this way. It's a nice, cool Sabbath day, which is very nice today. This morning, I'd like to turn your attention to the Apostle Paul, if I could. I'd like you to turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I want to read through a short section here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul is rebutting, I believe, the foolishness of the Corinthians in their boasting about how they have suffered for Christ's sake. And he says, well, since you're boasting, I'm going to boast as well what I've gone through for Christ's sake. And he's going to tell them, among other things, that he was shipwrecked. And you remember some of the stories of what Paul went through. But let's pick this up in the middle of verse 23 here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where he goes on to say, in labors more abundant, in verse 23 of 2 Corinthians 11, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, and I take that wasn't a fast of his desire, probably not of his desire, in cold and nakedness. You know, in the next chapter, we see the church convening a committee. We see the church convening a committee and bringing up the fact that Paul was behaving foolishly and putting his life at risk. The committee couldn't understand how Paul kept putting himself in these positions over and over, to be beaten 3 times, to be in a position where he was lashed 5 times. Surely the shipwreck, where he was taken by the Roman military wasn't his fault of the 2. All of these things he put him in. The committee said, never again. By the way, there was no committee. If you're wondering, in the next chapter, you're like, where's this committee? It wasn't there. All right, I'm being facetious here. There's a little bit of sarcasm. Church never put together a committee to look at why he was being so foolish. But I poke a little fun at this because I want you to see that Paul took responsibility and risk for his own life. A lot of it. I mean, tremendous things that he went through, and he didn't say, well, I better not do that again. Now, maybe there were some things he learned, I'm sure there was, about certain things to avoid, but he went through a lot of stuff. The title of my message today is Personal Responsibility in the Kingdom. Personal Responsibility in the Kingdom. You know, I thought that for the past 2 years that the government's response to the pandemic has been a great opportunity for us in the church to compare and contrast the way God's kingdom should run or will run versus the way that the world runs this kingdom we live in. And it's not always, I should say it's a very stark contrast in many cases. But at the center of the discussion, I believe that personal responsibility should be there. It all begins right there, personal responsibility. Under God's law, each individual bears responsibility for his own actions. Ezekiel makes this point, and I'm going to read this. You don't need to turn there for time's sake, but if you want to, you're welcome to do that. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20. Ezekiel's going to make the point here very clearly and strongly in chapter 18 that you bear responsibility for your decisions, good or bad. The whole chapter, a good chunk of the chapter deals with that. But he says here in chapter 18 and verse 20, the soul who sins, it is the one who will die. The son will not bear the iniquity of his father, and a father will not bear the iniquity of his son. The righteousness of the righteous man will fall upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked man will fall upon him. It is the individual responsibility. This means that the individual has to take responsibility for what they do. Now, unfortunately, we live in a society today that plays the victim. We see it over and over again. The victim card is constantly played. Nobody wants to take responsibility for anything and seems to always blame someone else for everything that goes wrong, but clearly want to accept the praise, I should say, for everything that goes right. Well, I will take the praise for that, but if it happened in the wrong way, that wasn't my fault. That was somebody else's problem. Sadly, it was at one point, and it might still be in some places, that people believed that if you didn't wear a mask and if you weren't vaccinated and if you didn't social distance and you didn't get tested, then you were a walking murderer. Now, some people might still believe that. That is a horrible thing that we've put upon ourselves, to think that we're walking murderers. Because if you wore a mask or you got vaccinated or you got tested, the idea was that you could stop the virus in its tracks. Nothing could be further from the truth. The government's response to the virus and misinformation campaign has divided this country like never before. Ever. I don't see it ever. And tied to that are all of the other effects that came out of it. It's impossible to decouple the current economic and political crisis today from the pandemic response. Inflation is a direct consequence of our policies that came out of pandemia. No question about it. You could say the presidency was as well. Lots of things, social and economic turmoil in this world as a response from the pandemic. Credentialism has risen to levels unseen since Nazi Germany. What's your credentials? Are you qualified to make a statement? Is above your pay grade on certain things? No one today is offered to allow an opinion if they aren't credentialed. You know, I'm credentialed. I'm credentialed in the state of Missouri as a primary care provider. I'm credentialed, but I don't have the right credentials. Not the right credentials. There are MDs who are credentialed, epidemiologists, virologists, infectious disease specialists. They're all credentialed. But their opinion doesn't matter unless they follow only the credential that matters, and that's what comes down from the top levels of the government agencies. And their credential decisions have directly led to the seizing of individual liberty and therefore responsibility as well. The outcomes we are living witnesses to today, some of which include increased poverty around the globe. Before the pandemic, poverty was at the lowest level in history. Today, it is massively on the rise. Skyrocketing teen suicides are up. Increase in cancer deaths and cancer diagnosis. Increase in alcohol and drug use. Increase in depression. Increase in cardiomyopathy in teens and young adults. Increase in the national debt. Increase in all-cause mortality, and most importantly, the further erosion of the family unit with the rise of BLM and transgenderism and teacher unions in this society, which is a direct response from pandemia. The response all led to changes in state laws to skew presidential elections and the general loosening of morality at the expense of so-called safety. And this is all that's come out of this. You see, the government said that, you know, you are not credentialed. You're not credentialed, so you can't make your own decisions. We have to make them for you. I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 25. There are two parables that Jesus gave us, and we're going to read these back-to-back parables so I can bring a lesson out of this. Matthew chapter 25, and Jesus is going to speak here. The first one is the parable of the 10 virgins. He says in verse 1, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps, went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. And as the bridegroom delayed, they all became drowsy and they slept. But at midnight there was a cry, 'Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' And then all those virgins arose and they trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oils, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'Since there will not be enough for you and for us, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves.' And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. And afterward the other virgins came also, saying, 'Lord, open to us.' And he said, 'Truly, truly, I don't know you.'" And then Jesus goes directly into the next parable, the parable of the talents. "For it will be like a man," in verse 14, "going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to the other 2, to another one, each according to his ability. And then he went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded them, and he made 5 more talents. And so he who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. And he who had received the 1 talent went away, dug in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of the servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, so I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And he who also had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents, and here I've made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And he who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. Verse 26, but his master answered, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away from him. Quite a story that Jesus has put back to back there, those 2 parables right there. I think there are many lessons that we can draw from 2 parables, as it were these 2 witnesses that he's put here. But the one I want to particularly draw your attention to, I think, is very clearly this: that of personal responsibility in these parables. Notice that the 5 young women here, these virgins, were never called foolish. Take that back. Were never called selfish. They were never called selfish for not giving the oil to the foolish young virgins. They were diligent about keeping their oil full, and the 5 foolish should have been as well. But they weren't, and they didn't. And in the parable of the talents, we see that the Lord demands personal responsibility from us as well. We're responsible to take the talents that God has given to us and multiply them, to make more, to grow. Inherent in increasing talents is the possibility of risk. That's all there. The man who took the 5 talents, he had to risk something to be able to get the 5 more. The man with the 2 to risk something to get the 2 more. To increase anything, risk is involved. Whether it's starting your own business, there's risk that you may lose everything. Sowing farmland for wheat, there's risk that there may not be rain, or there may be blight, or something of that nature. Investing in the market, there's risk in the market. There's risk in life. Life involves risk, and you have a personal responsibility to take that risk in order to increase your talents. The 3rd servant decided, I'm not going to take the risk. And what did he do? He buried his 1 talent in the ground, and it grew nothing. There was nothing given back from that. He was the car, as it were, that never left the garage. He was the plane that never left the hangar. He was the ship that never set sail. Brethren, do you know what happens to cars that sit around in garages? They rust, and the carburetor becomes rusty, and you can't get it started. Sometimes you have to overhaul the engine. The oil leaks out of the pan. It becomes useless. You know what happens to a hangar that sits, a plane that sits in the hangar? It does. It's pretty much the same thing. It rusts. It turns to decay. You've got to use it. It's got to do something. Do you know what happens to the ship that sits in the harbor the whole time? It collects barnacles on the hull because it's not moving, and it will destroy that outer hull. Brethren, cars were made to drive, planes were made to fly, and ships were made to sail. What were you made for? What were you made for? You were made to take your talents and to grow them. Were you made to stay in your house? Nope, you were not. You were made to live. You were made to move. You were made to take risks, and you were made to take responsibility, personal responsibility for everything you do. Everything you do. And in the case of the pandemic, it's personal responsibility for your health. It's personal responsibility for what those things are that can give you the best chance at surviving any illness around. It doesn't matter what it is. You have personal responsibility for your life and for your decisions. And this is what God wants from us. To gather the oil, to increase the talent, it might take a shipwreck, brethren. It might take what Paul went through. It might take a stoning. It might take a lashing. It might take a beating. It might take perils in the deep, or it may take a fast that you don't want to take. But those are the types of things that it takes to grow into a God being.